The auctioneer's hammer came down on the church steps of Briar Hollow, and the sound it made was small, one wooden crack, but to Hannah Yoon, it landed like a rifle shot. On the folding table before her lay her mother's silk ribbon, jade green, worn thin from a decade of careful folding, held up by a stranger's fingers for men to bid on like livestock. The crowd laughed. Somewhere behind her, a woman said the word Hannah had heard 100 times since Elias died. Foreign, and now, finally penniless. Hannah did not move. Stillness was the only dignity left to steal. At the edge of the crowd, half hidden in the shade of the livery, a rancher named Caleb Hargrove watched the ribbon change hands and felt something in his chest go hard and still, the way it always did before he did something this town would talk about for years. He had not come to buy anything. He had come because Deacon Silas Pruitt had called a dead man's debts due, and Elias Whitfield's widow had nothing left to pay them with but a trunk she had carried across an ocean. Caleb turned a silver dollar once between his fingers. Then the auctioneer called for the next bid, and his hand went up before Pruitt's man could even ask. A murmur ran through the crowd, like wind through dry wheat. Caleb Hargrove did not bid on land. He did not bid on cattle, on tools, on anything a sensible man wanted at auction, and yet there he stood, buying a ribbon for 4 times what silk was worth, while Silas Pruitt's smile thinned into something that was no longer amused. Hannah lifted her eyes for the first time since the hammer had fallen. She did not know this man. She knew only that when the auctioneer held up the next piece of her mother's life, Caleb's hand rose again before anyone else's could. Nobody in Briar Hollow had ever seen a man bid on another family's grief the way Caleb Hargrove bid that morning, piece after piece, ribbon and letter and locket, as if he meant to buy back every hour of shame the town had heaped on a widow it had decided did not belong. What none of them knew yet, not even Hannah, was how far back his reasons ran, or how much of that trunk still waited, unopened, at the bottom, holding a truth about her father that even she had never fully understood. By sundown, he intended to own every piece of it. 2 years earlier, Hannah Yoon had stepped off a train in Cheyenne, carrying a single trunk and a photograph of a man she had never met, and told herself that whatever waited at the end of the platform would be better than what she had left behind. Elias Whitfield had turned out to be gentler than the photograph suggested, a homesteader nearing 50, quiet in the particular way of men who have farmed alone too long, who met her at the station with his hat in his hands and did not know where to look. The wagon ride out to the homestead took the better part of an afternoon, past fence lines and grazing cattle, and a horizon so wide and so empty of anything familiar that Hannah had pressed her hand flat against the trunk in her lap, simply to feel something solid. Elias talked the whole way nervously about the well he had dug and the garden plot he hoped she might like, filling the silence the way a man fills silence when he is more afraid of a stranger's judgment than he will ever admit. He had not asked her to become someone else. That alone, in the first weeks, felt like a kindness larger than any she had expected to find, in a country that stared at her on the street as though she had grown up out of the wrong soil. They married within the week, in a service so brief the Reverend forgot her name twice. Hannah learned to run a homestead the way she had once learned embroidery, patiently, precisely, without complaint, while the town watched from a careful distance and decided, without ever quite saying it aloud, that she was tolerated and never welcomed. It was, she told herself, enough. She did not yet know how quickly enough could be taken away. Elias's cough began the second winter, a small dry thing he waved off as dust in his chest, and by spring it had hollowed him into a man Hannah barely recognized from the photograph she still kept folded in her trunk. Doc Reeve came twice a week and charged what he could, though he never once asked Hannah to pay it in front of anyone, a mercy she would not forget. The debts that mattered more were the ones Elias had already carried before she arrived, alone against the homestead taken years earlier from Silas Pruitt's bank, renewed and renewed again. The kind of paper that grows heavier the longer a man is too proud to speak of it. Elias died in the first hard frost of the 3rd year. In the bed Hannah had made him, his hand in hers, his last words an apology she did not fully understand until the note came due. Deacon Pruitt arrived at the homestead 11 days after the burial, black coat buttoned to the throat, a ledger under his arm, and informed her, gently he said, as though gentleness were a costume he wore for occasions like this, that a widow with no name of her own in this country could not simply inherit a debt. She would have to answer for it. Pruitt did not call it seizure, he called it settlement, a word he used the way other men use scripture, and he chose the church steps for the same reason he chose his words carefully, because a debt collected in the shadow of a cross looked to Briar Hollow less like cruelty and more like order restored. Word traveled fast in a town with one street and one grievance to share. By the time the notice was nailed to the mercantile door, half of Briar Hollow had already decided that the foreign widow up at the Whitfield place had gotten more than she deserved, simply by marrying into land that should have stayed in decent hands. Nobody asked what Hannah would live on afterward. Nobody asked where a woman with no family within 6,000 miles was meant to go, once her home and her husband's name were both gone. What they asked quietly over coffee in church pews was what exactly a Korean bride kept in a trunk that size, and whether there might be something in it worth the trip into town on a Saturday morning, if only to look. Mrs. Colton in particular had taken to saying, within Hannah's hearing more than once, that a decent Christian town owed a foreign widow nothing beyond what simple charity required, and that whatever curiosities a trunk that size might hold were, in her opinion, exactly the sort of thing an auction existed to bring properly into the light. Hannah heard the question secondhand from Doc Reeves' daughter and understood for the first time that this was never going to be only about money. On the morning of the auction, 2 of Pruitt's hired men carried the trunk down from the wagon and set it on the church steps as though it were furniture, and not the sum of everything Hannah had carried out of one life and into another. She stood where they told her to stand, at the edge of the crowd, close enough to be seen and far enough to be talked about, while Pruitt climbed the steps in his black coat and opened the trunk himself, unhurried, enjoying, she was certain of it, the particular theater of a locked thing being pried open in public. Inside, folded with a care that had crossed an ocean intact, lay the pieces of a life no one in Briar Hollow had ever asked her about. Silk the color of jade, paper tied with faded string, a small wooden box, something wrapped in linen. She had not unwrapped herself in over 2 years. The crowd leaned in. Pruitt's hand closed around the first item, held it up into the morning light for every eye in Briar Hollow to appraise, and the auctioneer beside him drew a breath to call the opening bid. The first item was the ribbon, jade green silk, frayed soft at both ends from being tied and untied 1,000 times, and the auctioneer held it high enough that the whole crowd could see it catch the light. Someone in the back called out that it looked like a scrap fit for a dog's collar, and a ripple of laughter went through Briar Hollow that made Hannah's face burn hotter than the morning sun. She knew what that ribbon was, even if none of them ever would. It had belonged to her mother, who had worn it at her own wedding in a house with a tiled roof and a courtyard full of persimmon trees, and who had pressed it into Hannah's hands on the dock at Busan, with instructions to keep it no matter what she had to sell to survive in the country she was sailing toward. Everything else, her mother had said, you may lose, not this. The auctioneer called for an opening bid of 50 cents, expecting by the sound of his voice that no one would trouble himself to pay it. Caleb's bid came before the auctioneer finished his sentence, and it was not 50 cents, it was $2, an amount so far beyond a scrap of silk's worth that a ripple of confusion passed through the crowd faster than the earlier laughter had. Pruitt's man, a lean fellow named Curtis, who did whatever the deacon paid him to do, glanced toward the church steps for instruction, and then raised his hand to $3, more out of habit than intent. Nobody bid against Caleb Hargrove for sport. Not since the winter he had put a man through the saloon window for less provocation than this. It was a story townsfolk still told with equal parts fear and admiration, embellished a little more each winter, though the one detail that never changed in the retelling was that the man in question had insulted a widow at the mercantile counter, and Caleb had not needed a second reason. Caleb answered with 5. Curtis looked to Pruitt again. Pruitt, arms folded over his black coat, gave the smallest shake of his head, a man unwilling to be seen losing a public argument over string. The hammer fell. Caleb Hargrove had just paid $5 for a strip of green silk no bigger than a man's hand, and every person on those church steps, including Hannah, was left wondering the same unspoken question, why? For one moment, while Curtis carried the ribbon down the steps to hand it over, Caleb's eyes found Hannah's across the crowd, and neither of them said anything at all. There was nothing in Briar Hollow's unwritten rules that allowed a rancher to speak to a widow at her own auction, and both of them knew it. He only nodded once, the way a man nods to acknowledge a debt he intends to pay, and then looked away before anyone could read more into it than a nod. Pruitt, watching from the top of the steps, did not miss it. He straightened his ledger with 2 fingers, the gesture of a man recalculating an afternoon that was no longer going the way he had planned. And when he spoke next, his voice had sharpened into something almost pleasant, which in Pruitt's mouth was always the most dangerous register he owned. Next, he announced they would move to the letters, a bundle of them, unopened as far as anyone could tell, tied with string and written, he said, in characters not one soul in this town could read. Perhaps, he added, someone ought to find out what secrets a foreign bride kept from her own husband. The words landed exactly where Pruitt had aimed them. Hannah felt the blood leave her face. Because those letters were not secrets kept from Elias, he had known of them, had even asked once gently if she wanted him to read them to her, since her English was still young when they arrived, and she had told him no, not yet, and he had never asked again. What Pruitt did not know, what no one on those steps could possibly know, was that Hannah herself had never finished reading them either. They had arrived one at a time over 2 years, each one thinner than the last, each one from her mother's hand growing more careful, more measured, as though her mother were choosing her words the way a woman chooses which coins to spend when there are not many left. Hannah had read the first 3. The rest she had tied together and put away, unable to face whatever news waited inside them, telling herself there would be time later, when she was less afraid of what her mother might finally be forced to say. Now, a stranger's hands were reaching for that string in front of the entire town. The bundle went up before the crowd had settled from Pruitt's remark, and it was Agnes Colton, the Reverend's cousin, and the nearest thing Briar Hollow had to a mayor of opinion, who called out that surely, before anyone paid good money for a stack of foreign paper, they ought to know what it said. It was, Hannah would later understand, not really about the letters at all, but about a grudge Agnes had nursed since her own son had once asked, quietly and only once, whether the new widow up at the Whitfield place might make a fine second wife for a lonely rancher 2 counties over, a suggestion Agnes had never forgiven either of them for. She did not wait for permission. She climbed 2 steps, plucked the top letter from the bundle before the auctioneer could stop her, and broke the string with a snap that seemed to echo louder than it should have. Hannah's stomach dropped. Agnes turned the letter over in her hands as though searching for a translation to appear on the page by will alone, and when it did not, she read aloud the only words she recognized, 3 characters, copied crudely by whoever had once taught her the shape of them, that Hannah knew instantly were not words at all but a name, her father's name. Agnes did not know that. She only knew it sounded foreign and looked strange, and she said so, loudly to general laughter, holding the letter up like evidence in a trial no one had agreed to hold. Caleb crossed the churchyard before Agnes had finished laughing, close enough that his shadow fell over the letter in her hands and said only 2 words, "That's enough," in a voice pitched low enough that it was not quite a threat and not quite a request either, though everyone within 20 feet understood it as both. Agnes lowered the letter. She did not hand it over so much as let it go. The way a person releases something they have suddenly remembered is not theirs to hold. And Caleb took the whole bundle from the auctioneer's table before the bidding had even formally opened, laying down a sum large enough that no one bothered to contest it. He did not look at what he had bought. He walked directly to Hannah and placed the letters in her hands, strings still broken, and said nothing else, because there was nothing a man could say on a church step in front of half the county that would not become the next thing Briar Hollow talked about for a year. Hannah closed her fingers around the bundle and felt, for the first time since the hammer had fallen, something other than shame. It was only later, once the auction had moved past her to the wooden box and Hannah had a moment alone at the edge of the crowd, that she allowed herself to look down at the letter Agnes had torn open, the one letter, of all of them, she had never had the courage to read. Her mother's handwriting had grown thin and hurried in the last months, nothing like the careful strokes of the earlier letters, and near the top of the page, before Hannah's eyes could stop themselves, she found the 2 words she had been dreading since the ship first left Busan Harbor, the magistrate. Beside it, her father's full name, written the formal way her mother only used when speaking of matters too serious for a daughter's comfort. Hannah had not finished the sentence before her hands began to shake, and she folded the letter closed again, not from fear of what Briar Hollow might see, but because 2 years was not, it turned out, nearly long enough to prepare her for whatever her mother had finally decided to tell her. She did not get the chance to read further. Behind her, the auctioneer's voice rose again, calling the crowd's attention to the next item pulled from the trunk, a small tin frame, its edges dented from the long crossing, holding a photograph of a man in scholar's robes that no one in Briar Hollow had ever seen and would have had no reason to recognize. Hannah's breath caught before she could stop it. Of everything in that trunk, the photograph was the one piece she had never let herself look at directly. Not once in 2 years, because looking at her father's face meant remembering the version of her family that existed before the magistrate's men came, before her mother pawned the last of the good silver to buy a single ticket west, before Hannah understood that being sent away and being saved were, in her family, the same word. Agnes Colton, still smarting from being silenced on the steps, raised her hand for the opening bid before anyone else could speak. Yun Tai-sang had been a teacher in a village 2 days' walk from Hanseong, a man who kept his back straight and his opinions plainer than was wise for the years he lived in, and who believed quietly and then less quietly that the kingdom's children deserved to read more than the old exams allowed them to know. He was not a revolutionary. Hannah, young as she was, understood even then that her father had never wanted to overturn anything, only to widen it, to let a little more light in through a door that powerful men preferred kept narrow. He kept a small shelf of primers he had copied out by hand for students whose families could not afford printed ones. And on quiet evenings, he would read to Hannah from them by lamplight, telling her that a mind, once it learned to ask why, could never again be fully governed by someone else's answer. He corresponded with reformist scholars in the capital. He taught farmers' daughters their letters alongside farmers' sons, which drew more suspicion in their district than either the letters or the daughters warranted. And when the unrest of 1884 swept through the capital and receded again, leaving the court hungrier than ever for names to blame, a man who had once written a single respectful letter to the wrong reformist found his name on a list he never should have been near. The magistrate's men came for him on a spring morning while Hannah was still asleep, and by the time she woke, her mother was already burning certain papers in the kitchen brazier and packing others, the ones that mattered, the ones too precious to burn, into the bottom of a trunk. Her mother never told her exactly what became of her father in the months that followed, only that a family already marked by the magistrate's suspicion could not afford a daughter of marrying age still living under its name, and that a matchmaker in the port town knew of American men seeking brides by photograph, decent men, homestead men, far enough from Hanseong's memory to matter. Hannah had not wanted to go. She said so more than once, in the small hours when her mother was too tired to argue. Her mother had only pressed the jade ribbon into her hands and said the words Hannah still heard some nights before sleep, that leaving was not the same as forgetting, and that a daughter alive in a strange country was worth more to a broken family than a daughter buried beside it. The auctioneer's voice pulled Hannah back to the church steps, to the tin-frame photograph now held aloft in the morning light, and to Agnes Colton's hand already raised for the opening bid. $1, she said, loud enough for the whole crowd to hear, as though buying a stranger's father might finally settle whatever score she believed the town was owed. Caleb answered without hesitation. $2 became 4, 4 became 8, and the crowd that had laughed at a ribbon an hour earlier fell into an uneasy silence as the numbers climbed past. Anything a photograph of an unknown foreign man could reasonably be worth to anyone but the woman standing at the edge of the churchyard with her hands pressed flat against her skirt. Agnes's husband tugged once at her sleeve, a warning Hannah recognized even from a distance, that his wife was spending money now out of pride alone, with no clear floor beneath her feet. Agnes did not stop at $8. She went to 10, then 12, her voice rising with each number, until it had less to do with photographs or foreign fathers and everything to do with a rancher who had never once, in 10 years of living beside Briar Hollow, let anyone see what mattered to him, and who was, in the space of a single morning, showing an entire town exactly that. Caleb's jaw tightened. He said 15, flat and final, in a voice that dared anyone to test whether he meant it. The churchyard went silent enough to hear the wind move through the flag above the schoolhouse. Agnes opened her mouth to answer him, closed it, opened it again, and it was in that breath of hesitation, with the whole town watching to see whether Caleb Hargrove would be beaten in public for the first time in his life, that the auctioneer's hammer came down before she could speak another number at all. Caleb carried the photograph down the steps himself this time, not sending Curtis or anyone else, and when he reached Hannah, he held it out with both hands, the way she imagined a man might hand over something breakable that he understood, without being told, was worth more than the $15 he had just spent to keep it out of Agnes Colton's parlor. Hannah took it carefully. Her father's face looked back at her from behind the dented tin frame, younger than she remembered him, unworried, a man who had not yet met the magistrate's men. "Thank you," she said, the English coming slower than she wanted it to, though steadier than it had been 2 years ago when she first stepped off the train, not knowing the word for stranger, let alone the words for gratitude toward one. She wanted to say more, wanted to tell him what the photograph meant, what her father's unworried face had cost her family to preserve. But the words for that lived somewhere English had not yet given her a door into, and so she said only the 2 words she had, and trusted, for once, that they might be enough. Caleb only nodded again. He seemed she was beginning to notice. A man who spent his words the way poorer men spent money, carefully, and only when it mattered. "Why are you doing this?" she asked him, the question she had been holding since the ribbon, and for a moment, Caleb looked as though he might actually answer it. His eyes went somewhere past her shoulder, toward the hills west of town, where his own ranch sat quiet and unbothered by any of this. And something in his face closed the way a door closes when a wind comes through a house too fast. "Because nobody else was going to," he said finally, which was true, and also not the whole truth. And Hannah was perceptive enough by then to hear the difference even in a language still new to her ear. Before she could ask anything further, the auctioneer called the crowd's attention back to the steps, where Pruitt himself had climbed up to announce, with visible relish, that they would move next to the wooden sewing box, a solid piece, he noted, that might interest a buyer for its craftsmanship alone, never mind whatever a foreign woman kept inside it. Somewhere behind Hannah, 2 ranch hands who had ridden in with Caleb that morning were talking low enough that they thought no one could hear, though Hannah's hearing had grown sharp in 2 years of being talked about rather than 2. "That's twice now," one of them murmured. He stood on this side of a church crowd instead of riding past it. "First time since Sarah." The second man made a sound that was not quite agreement and not quite comfort. The sound men make when a name still carries weight nobody wants to lift in daylight. And then they both fell quiet as though they had said more than they meant to. Hannah did not know who Sarah was. She only knew, from the particular way the name landed and the silence that followed it, that it belonged to a wound Caleb Hargrove had been carrying long before he ever raised a hand for her mother's ribbon, and that whatever had happened to Sarah was tangled up somehow in every dollar he was now spending on a stranger's grief. She watched him more carefully after that, the way a person studies a house they have only ever seen from the road, looking for the shape of what might be inside. He stood apart from the crowd even now, hat low, hands loose at his sides, in the particular stillness of a man keeping something contained by will alone. And she noticed, too, that he was not the only one whose face had changed since morning. Ruthie Reeve, the doctor's daughter, no older than 12, had stopped laughing along with the older women an hour ago, and now stood close to her father's side, watching the auction with an expression Hannah recognized, because she had worn it herself more than once. The particular discomfort of a child, realizing for the first time that the adults around her were not behaving as well as she had been taught grown people should. Pruitt did not wait for the discomfort to spread any further than it already had. He lifted the sewing box himself, turning it once in the light so the crowd could admire the joinery, dovetailed corners, a lid that closed without a single visible nail, the unmistakable work of a craftsman back in a country most of Briar Hollow could not have found on a map. "A fine box," Pruitt said, "worth something to any buyer regardless of what foolishness might be inside it," and he gave it a small shake for emphasis, the way a man shakes a gift to guess its contents before Christmas. Something inside shifted with a sound too solid to be thread or needles, a soft, deliberate knock, like a second lid hidden beneath the first, and Pruitt's expression flickered, just slightly, from performance into genuine curiosity. A few of the nearer townsfolk leaned in without meaning to, drawn by the particular hush that falls over a crowd sensing it is about to be given something it was not owed, and even Agnes Colton, still nursing her humiliation from the letters, went quiet enough to hear the box creak under Pruitt's testing fingers. Hannah's whole body went still. She had packed that box herself, years ago in her mother's kitchen, and she alone in that churchyard knew exactly what waited beneath its false bottom. Pruitt pressed his thumbnail into the seam along the box's base, testing for the give he had clearly already guessed was there, and told the crowd in his mildest, most dangerous voice that a hidden compartment in a widow's trunk was exactly the sort of thing a careful town ought to examine before letting money change hands. A few voices agreed with him too quickly, the way voices do when they have already decided what they hope to find. Hannah's knees went weak enough that she stepped back without meaning to, straight into the steadying hand of Doc Reeve, who had come to stand near her sometime in the last hour without her noticing, the way he had a habit of doing at bedsides where a patient needed someone nearby who was not counting money. "Easy now," he said quietly, not unkindly. "Whatever's in that box, it can't be worse than what this town's already decided about you, and decided wrong plenty of times before." He nodded toward Caleb, who stood watching Pruitt's hands on the box with the particular tension of a man remembering something he would rather not. "You want to know why he's doing all this?" Doc Reeve said, not quite a question, and Hannah found she did want to know, badly enough that she only nodded. "Caleb had a younger sister once," he told her, keeping his voice low enough that it would not carry past the two of them. "Sarah, good girl, kind, fell in with a drifter who didn't have the decency to stay once there was a child coming, and this town, same families standing on these same steps today, decided a girl in her condition wasn't fit for their pews or their charity, either one. Caleb was up in the high pasture chasing rustled stock when the worst blizzard in a decade came through, and by the time anyone thought to check on Sarah alone in that line shack, she and the town's decency had already run out of time together. Hannah felt something in her chest tighten that had nothing to do with her own trouble. "He wasn't here to stop it," Doc Reeve went on, "and he's never once let himself forget that, not in 6 years. Man like Caleb doesn't talk about guilt. He just shows up, every time this town decides to make an example of somebody it's already decided doesn't count, and he does something about it with his fists or his wallet, whichever the day calls for. That's not charity you're getting up there, Mrs. Whitfield. That's a man trying to keep a promise he made to a sister who isn't alive to hold him to it anymore." Hannah looked across the churchyard to where Caleb still stood, arms crossed, watching Pruitt's thumbnail work at the seam of her mother's box as though he could will the man's hands to stop through sheer force of attention, and understood, for the first time, that his kindness toward her was not really about her at all, and somehow that made it mean more, not less. She crossed to him while Pruitt was still occupied with the box, close enough to speak without the whole churchyard listening in. "I am sorry," she said, "for your sister. I did not know." Caleb's jaw worked once before he answered. The way it did, she was learning, whenever a thing mattered too much for an easy reply. "Wasn't your fault," he said. "Isn't really anybody's fault I can put a bullet in, which is the trouble with it." She wanted to tell him that she understood something of that particular kind of trouble, the kind with no single villain to blame and so no clean way to set it down, but the words felt too large for a churchyard, too large for the little time Pruitt's box had left them, and so she only nodded instead, and let the silence between them do the work her English still could not. Before Hannah could find the words to answer that, a sharp crack came from the steps above them. Pruitt's thumbnail had finally found the catch, and the sewing box's false bottom sprang open in his hands with a sound like a small door closing somewhere it should never have been opened at all. What lay beneath the false bottom was small enough to fit in Pruitt's palm, a seal of pale jade, carved with characters Hannah had known since childhood. The personal stamp her father had used to sign his lesson plans and his letters to reform as scholars in the capital. The very mark, she realized with a cold drop in her stomach, that the magistrate's men had likely used as evidence against him in the first place. A seal like that was not decoration. In the world her father had come from, it was a signature no forger could imitate and no court could dismiss, pressed in red ink at the bottom of every document that mattered, which meant that whoever now held it, however unknowingly, was holding the last physical proof that Yoon Tai-song had ever existed at all. Her mother must have smuggled it out before the men came a second time to search the house properly, hidden it in the one place no soldier searching a widow's sewing box would think to press a thumbnail. Pruitt held it up to the light, turning it as he had turned the ribbon and the photograph. But this time, his expression carried none of the earlier performance, only genuine, sharpening interest. The look of a man who has just found a thread he did not know existed and cannot help but pull. A seal like this belongs to a man of rank, Pruitt announced to the churchyard, turning the jade over once more for effect. And I'd wager good money it belonged to a man of rank who fell from that rank, for reasons this town has every right to ask about, before we go handing his daughter any more sympathy than we already have. The murmur that ran through the crowd this time had a different texture than the earlier laughter, colder, more suspicious. The particular ugliness of people looking for permission to believe the worst about someone they had already decided not to like. Pruitt let the silence stretch before adding, almost gently, that perhaps the debt owed to his bank ought to account for concealed property of unknown value, property a widow had, by his account, deliberately hidden from the very auction meant to settle her husband's affairs honestly. It was not a legal argument. It did not need to be, not on those steps, in front of that crowd.
"That's enough, Pruitt," Caleb said, and this time his voice carried the length of the churchyard without needing to be raised. "That seal came out of a trunk she carried here from Korea 2 years before she ever signed her name next to Elias Whitfield's, which makes it hers and only hers, same as it would be if she'd carried a Bible or a wedding ring instead. And unless you've found some way to put a Korean magistrate's business on Elias's ledger, it's got nothing to do with any debt owed this bank." Pruitt's mouth tightened. Around them a few heads had begun to nod, not many, but enough that Hannah felt something shift in the air of the churchyard for the first time all morning, a crack of daylight in a wall she had assumed was solid. "You'd know a great deal about a widow's private property, Hargrove," Pruitt said, low enough to sound almost dangerous, and Caleb answered him without blinking. "I know the law better than you'd like, Deacon. Comes from watching men like you use it against people who can't fight back." Pruitt held Caleb's stare for 3 long seconds before he looked away first, closing his hand around the jade seal and setting it back into its compartment with a care that did not match the coldness in his face. A man conceding a single skirmish while already redrawing the lines of a larger war. "Very well," he said, loud enough for the crowd to hear, as though generosity had been his intention all along. "The seal stays off the block," but he did not walk away without one last remark, pitched for Caleb alone as he turned to climb back up the church steps. A reminder, delivered almost pleasantly, that a homestead deed was a different matter entirely from a trunk full of keepsakes, and that Elias Whitfield's land still owed this bank considerably more than jade and photographs could ever cover. Caleb's expression did not change, but Hannah, watching him watch Pruitt's retreating back, understood that whatever ground had just been won on these church steps, the war Pruitt was promising had not even begun yet.
The last item Pruitt drew from the trunk was folded in linen that had gone soft and pale from handling, and when he unwrapped it on the top step, even the crowd that had laughed loudest that morning fell quiet because there was no mistaking what they were looking at, even without understanding it. A wedding hanbok, jeogori and chama, in a rose-pink silk so fine, it seemed to hold its own light, embroidered along the collar with cranes in flight, the kind of garment a mother spends a year making for a daughter. She believes will wear it surrounded by family. Hannah remembered her mother bent over that embroidery by candlelight for months, cursing softly at knots only she could see, insisting that cranes mated for life and so belonged on a garment meant to promise the same. An old superstition her mother had only half believed and had stitched in anyway for luck, for insurance against a world that gave a woman so little of either. Hannah had never worn it. She had married Elias Whitfield in a plain gray dress borrowed from the Reverend's wife, because a Korean wedding gown on a Wyoming homestead in 1883 would have drawn exactly the kind of attention she could not afford, and she had folded the handbook away instead, telling herself there would be another occasion someday, some version of her life, where it made sense to wear the last beautiful thing her mother had ever made her with her own two hands. The auctioneer called for an opening bid, and for the first time all morning, the churchyard offered him only silence. Agnes Colton kept her hands folded at her waist and did not raise them. Curtis glanced toward Pruitt for instruction and received none, because even Pruitt, calculating as he was, seemed to understand that bidding against a rancher over a dead woman's wedding dress had finally crossed some line even Briar Hollow's cruelty recognized when it saw it plainly enough. Caleb raised his hand and named a sum that made the auctioneer's eyebrows lift before the man caught himself. No one answered him. Ruthie Reeve, standing at her father's side, slipped her small hand into his and did not look away from Hannah even once. The way a child watches something she has decided in her own private accounting is right, regardless of what the adults around her have spent all morning pretending was fair. The hammer came down, and with it, the auction that had begun with a 50-cent ribbon ended with Caleb Hargrove owning, item for item, everything Silas Pruitt had dragged out of Hannah Yoon's trunk to sell on the steps of a church in front of the entire county. The auctioneer read the total from his ledger in a voice that had lost most of its earlier showmanship, a sum large enough that a few men in the back exchanged glances, doing arithmetic on what exactly a rancher's herd was worth, against what he had just spent on ribbon and letters and a wedding dress belonging to a woman he had, as far as anyone in Briar Hollow knew, exchanged perhaps a dozen words with in his life. Pruitt closed his ledger without comment, his earlier pleasantness gone entirely now, replaced by the flat expression of a man recalculating every assumption he had walked onto those steps with that morning. The crowd began to thin the way crowds do once the entertainment has run its course, though the whispering did not stop so much as change shape, drifting from cruelty into something closer to curiosity as townsfolk climbed into wagons and speculated, in low voices, about what exactly Caleb Hargrove intended to do with a trunk full of another family's most private belongings. Some guessed he meant to keep it all at the ranch as proof of the morning's victory, a rich man's curiosity displayed on a shelf. Others, remembering Sarah, said nothing at all and simply watched him load the trunk onto his own wagon himself, refusing Curtis's help, handling the jade seal and the folded handbook with a care that did not match the rough hands of a man who spent his days breaking horses and mending fence line. Hannah stood apart from all of it, watching her whole trunk disappear onto the back of a stranger's wagon, with no way yet of knowing what he meant to do with everything he had just spent a small fortune to win. That evening, as the last light went copper over the Wyoming plains, Caleb Hargrove's wagon pulled up outside the small room Hannah had been renting from the seamstress since the homestead's fate had gone uncertain. And for a long moment, she stood in the doorway watching him climb down without understanding what he had come to do. She had assumed, like most of Briar Hollow, that the trunk was his now, fairly bought and fairly his to keep. And some quiet, tired part of her had already begun grieving it the way she had learned to grieve most things in the last 2 years, privately, without expecting the loss to be noticed or undone. Caleb said nothing by way of greeting. He simply lowered the trunk from the wagon bed, careful of his footing on the seamstress's uneven step, and set it down just inside the doorway as though it belonged there and had never belonged anywhere else. He opened the lid himself and began setting each piece back inside with the same unhurried care he had shown carrying it to the wagon that morning, the ribbon first, then the letters, restrung with new twine he must have bought for the purpose, then the photograph in its dented tin frame, the sewing box with its false bottom closed once more over the jade seal, and last, folded exactly as her mother had folded it, the rose-pink handbag with its embroidered cranes. Hannah watched him work in silence, unable to find a single word in either language for what she was witnessing. She thought, watching his rough rancher's hands move with such unlikely gentleness over silk and paper, of her mother's hands doing the same work years earlier in a kitchen half a world away, and understood that care, in the end, looked the same in any language, needed no translation at all, only two people willing to offer it without being asked twice. When he finished, he straightened and looked at her directly for perhaps the first time since the hammer had first fallen that morning. "I didn't buy any of it to keep," he said. "Every piece just needed to end up somewhere Pruitt couldn't reach it. And this seemed like the only way this town was going to let that happen without a fight I wasn't ready to lose in a courtroom. It was never mine. It was only ever going to be yours again." Hannah's eyes filled before she could stop them, which embarrassed her more than the auction itself had, and she pressed the back of her hand briefly to her mouth the way her mother used to when emotion threatened to become unseemly in front of company. "You did not have to spend so much," she said, "when the whole town believed you were spending it on grief alone." Caleb was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer at all. "Wasn't only grief," he admitted finally, looking somewhere past her shoulder, the way he did whenever the truth cost him something to say aloud. "Somewhere around the third or fourth thing I bought back, it stopped being about Sarah and started being about you standing on those steps not flinching, not once, while half this county tried to make you feel small enough to disappear. Didn't much care for watching that. Didn't much care for the idea of not doing something about it either." The moment might have gone further, might have found its way toward whatever neither of them had yet been brave enough to say plainly, if Doc Reeves' buggy had not come rattling up the street at a pace that told its own story before the doctor even opened his mouth. "Pruitt's filed papers with the territorial clerk," Doc Reeves said, catching his breath, barely waiting for either of them to greet him properly. "Says Elias's homestead claim was never legally transferred to Hannah on account of some clause about foreign wives and property rights. Nobody in this territory has bothered enforcing in a decade, not until tonight. Not until a bank stood to gain 160 acres of prime grazing land instead of a debt he'd have to collect the slow way. Hearing set for Thursday in town, in front of the whole county if Pruitt has anything to say about it, which he surely will." Hannah felt the ground shift beneath the small, fragile piece she had only just begun to feel in her own chest. The homestead was not much, a modest house, a well that ran low in August. Fields Elias had worked half crippled by his cough for the better part of 2 years, but it was the only piece of ground in this entire country that had ever, even briefly, been called hers, and the thought of Pruitt taking it too, on top of everything else he had already tried to take, made her hands close hard around the edge of the newly returned trunk. Caleb's jaw set in the way she now recognized meant a decision had already been made somewhere behind his eyes. Thursday, he repeated, mostly to himself, and something in the way he said the word made it sound less like a date and more like a promise. Whatever Pruitt intends to bring to that hearing, he wasn't going to face it alone.
The territorial clerk's office was too small to hold the number of people who came to Briar Hollow that Thursday, so the hearing moved to the church steps once more, the same steps where the auction had taken place, an irony not lost on anyone who had stood there a week earlier. Pruitt made his case first, citing the old clause about foreign wives with the confidence of a man who had never once been made to answer for using the law only when it served him. Several in the crowd exchanged uneasy glances at that, remembering, perhaps for the first time in years, that Pruitt's bank had called in more than one debt against families who had since quietly left the territory, and wondering, now that the pattern was spoken of in daylight, how many of those departures had truly been as voluntary as the town had assumed. Caleb answered by laying two things on the clerk's table in front of the whole county. The marriage certificate proving Hannah's claim to the homestead was never in question under any statute the clerk could find still valid, and a second document, obtained through a lawyer in Cheyenne, Caleb had ridden 2 days to consult, showing that the sum collected at last week's auction had already exceeded Elias Whitfield's outstanding debt by a considerable margin, meaning Pruitt's bank owed Hannah money, not the reverse.
A murmur went through the crowd that had none of the cruelty of the week before in it, only the particular hush of people realizing they had spent a Saturday morning laughing at a woman who had, it now appeared, been owed money by the very man orchestrating her humiliation. The clerk studied both documents for a long, silent minute before ruling, in a voice that carried clean across the churchyard, that the Whitfield homestead remained Hannah Yoon's outright, and that Deacon Silas Pruitt's bank would be refunding the difference within 30 days, or answering to the territorial court instead. It was, by any measure Briar Hollow understood, a rare and public kind of reckoning, the sort that happened to ordinary men perhaps once in a town's whole history. And it had happened because one rancher had refused to let a widow face it alone. Pruitt's face had gone the color of old ash. He gathered his ledger and left without another word, and for the first time in 2 years, Hannah watched Briar Hollow's collective attention turn toward him instead of her, uncertain, murmuring, recalculating everything it had assumed about who in this town actually deserved suspicion. Agnes Colton did not apologize, not exactly. Hannah understood by now that women like Agnes rarely found the words for that kind of admission, but she did cross the churchyard afterward and say, stiffly, that she supposed a person could be forgiven for wondering what she'd have done in Hannah's position, arriving alone in a country that never once asked if she wanted to belong to it. It was not much. Hannah decided, watching Agnes retreat before an answer could be given, that it did not need to be much to matter. Ruthie Reeve made no such effort at restraint, running across the churchyard to wrap both arms around Hannah's waist the moment her father's back was turned, declaring to anyone still listening that she had known all along Mrs. Whitfield hadn't done anything wrong, not once, not ever, and several of the women nearby had the grace to look at their own boots rather than meet Hannah's eyes. By the time the first real frost of that autumn came to the Whitfield homestead, the trunk no longer traveled anywhere at all. It sat at the foot of the bed in the room Hannah had once shared with Elias, and now, by a quiet agreement, neither of them had rushed into, and both of them had chosen plainly, shared with Caleb. Its lid opened more often than closed, because there was no longer any reason to keep its contents folded away from daylight. The rose-pink handbag hung from a peg by the window, catching what little sun came through in the mornings. Her father's photograph stood on the shelf beside her mother's letters, all of them read now, every last page, including the final one Hannah had been too afraid to open for 2 years, which had said, in the end, only what a mother always means to say to a daughter sent far from home, that she was proud, that she was loved, and that leaving had saved more than it had cost. Hannah had wept reading that line, not from grief this time, but from something closer to relief. The particular relief of a daughter finally released from wondering whether the hardest decision of her mother's life had been the right one. Caleb found her there one evening, tracing the jade ribbon between her fingers the way she often did when the past came calling quietly instead of cruelly, and he said the thing he had apparently been turning over since a church auction 6 months earlier, that he intended to spend the rest of his life bidding on nothing in this world except keeping her exactly this safe, exactly this whole, for as long as she would let him. Hana, for the first time since Busan Harbor, believed every word of a promise completely.